The rain hammered against the windows of Murphy's diner with a relentless fury that seemed to mirror the storm brewing inside Marcus Wellington's chest. "Just before we start, drop a flag emoji that represents your country." He sat in the corner booth, his $1,000 suit looking oddly out of place among the cracked vinyl seats and flickering neon signs. The coffee in his cup had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Not yet. Not until he understood what was happening to him, this strange compulsion that had driven him to abandon his penthouse office and wander into this forgotten corner of the city where nobody knew his name or his net worth. At 62, Marcus Wellington controlled an empire worth $3 billion. His construction company had built half the skyscrapers that defined the city's skyline, and his real estate ventures had transformed entire neighborhoods. He was a man accustomed to commanding respect with a single glance, to having his every word treated as gospel by boards of directors and city planners alike. Yet here he sat, anonymous and invisible, in a diner that probably generated less revenue in a year than he made in an hour. The young waitress approached his table with cautious steps, her worn sneakers squeaking against the checkered linoleum floor. She couldn't have been more than 25, with auburn hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and eyes that held a weariness far beyond her years. Her uniform was clean but faded, the fabric thin from countless washings, and Marcus noticed how she kept tugging at the hem as if trying to make it cover more than it could. "More coffee, sir?" she asked, her voice soft but professional. There was something familiar about her tone, a cadence that tickled the edges of his memory like a half-remembered melody. Marcus nodded, watching as she poured the steaming liquid with steady hands, despite the exhaustion he could see etched in the lines around her eyes. She couldn't be making more than minimum wage in a place like this, probably working double shifts just to make ends meet. The thought bothered him more than it should have, stirring something uncomfortable in his chest. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. When was the last time he'd genuinely thanked someone for such a simple gesture? When was the last time he'd noticed the person behind the service? She offered a tired smile and turned to leave. But something made Marcus speak again. "Busy night?" The question surprised them both. Marcus Wellington didn't make small talk with waitresses. He didn't linger in diners past midnight, nursing cold coffee and watching the world through rain-streaked windows. Yet here he was, genuinely curious about this young woman's life. "Every night's busy when you're working 3 jobs, she replied with a rueful laugh. "But I shouldn't complain. Work is work, right? 3 jobs. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. This girl was working 3 jobs, probably struggling to pay rent on some cramped apartment while he owned homes he visited twice a year. The disparity felt obscene, but what truly disturbed him was his sudden, overwhelming need to understand her story. 3 jobs, he repeated, shaking his head. "That must be exhausting." She shrugged, a gesture that spoke of long practice in making the unbearable seem ordinary. "You do what you have to do. My dad always said that honest work never killed anybody, even if it felt like it might some days." And the mention of her father sparked something in Marcus's memory, a flicker of recognition that he couldn't quite place. There was something about the way she carried herself, a dignity that poverty couldn't touch, that reminded him of someone from long ago. "Your father sounds like a wise man," Marcus said carefully. The girl's expression softened, and for a moment the professional mask slipped away. He died 5 years ago, but his words still keep me going when things get tough." She paused, studying Marcus with sudden intensity. "You know, you remind me of someone he used to talk about, someone he worked for back when I was little." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. The coffee cup trembled in his hands as a parade of faces from his past began marching through his memory. 20, 30, 40 years of employees, contractors and workers whose names he'd never bothered to learn, whose families he'd never asked about, whose lives had intersected with his empire in ways he'd never considered significant enough to remember. What was your father's name? The question escaped his lips before he could stop it, driven by a dread that was rapidly consuming his composure. Thomas Chen, she said, and Marcus Wellington's world tilted on its axis. The name hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest, bringing with it a flood of memories he'd buried beneath decades of success and wealth. Thomas Chen, the site foreman who'd worked for Wellington Construction for 15 years. Thomas Chen, who'd been in charge of the Riverside Shopping Complex project back in 1998. Thomas Chen, who died in that terrible accident that Marcus had spent years trying to forget. Marcus's hands began to shake uncontrollably, and he had to set down his coffee cup before he spilled it all over the table. The diner around him seemed to blur and shift, the fluorescent lights becoming too bright, the sounds of other patrons fading to a distant hum. He was back there, standing in his office 25 years ago, staring at the accident report that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "You're Emily," he whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Emily Chen." The young woman's eyes widened in shock. "How do you know my name?" Marcus couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. He was drowning in memories of cutting corners, of choosing profit margins over safety protocols, of ignoring Thomas Chen's repeated warnings about structural weaknesses in the scaffolding system. He remembered dismissing the foreman's concerns as overly cautious, remembered telling his project managers that Chen was getting old and losing his nerve. The accident had happened on a Tuesday morning in March. A support beam had given way, sending 3 workers plummeting 40 feet to the concrete below. Thomas Chen had tried to save them, had rushed forward without thought for his own safety, and had been crushed when the entire scaffolding system collapsed. 2 of the workers had survived with serious injuries. Thomas had died on the way to the hospital, leaving behind a young wife and a daughter who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Marcus had attended the funeral, of course. It was expected, the proper thing to do. He'd stood in the back of the small church, listening to the priest talk about Thomas's dedication to his family and his unwavering commitment to doing the right thing, even when it cost him everything. He'd watched a little girl with auburn hair cry for her daddy, watched a young woman try to hold herself together while her world crumbled around her. And then he'd written a check. A substantial one, he'd told himself at the time, enough to cover the funeral expenses and provide some temporary relief for the widow and child. He'd convinced himself that he was being generous, that the accident was a tragedy, but not his fault, that these things happened in construction and there was nothing more he could have done. But there had been something more he could have done. The investigation had been quietly settled, the safety violations swept under an avalanche of legal paperwork and financial settlements. Marcus had learned to live with the knowledge that his cost-cutting measures had contributed to Thomas Chen's death, had buried that guilt beneath layers of success and philanthropy and public recognition. Now, 25 years later, Thomas Chen's daughter was pouring his coffee and working 3 jobs to survive. "You're Marcus Wellington," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. The coffee pot trembled in her hands as the full weight of recognition settled over her features. "You're the man who killed my father." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Marcus wanted to deny it, to explain that it had been an accident, that he hadn't meant for anyone to get hurt. But looking into Emily's eyes, seeing the pain and exhaustion and quiet dignity that her father had possessed, he found that the words wouldn't come. Instead, he saw himself as he truly was for the first time in decades. Not the successful businessman, not the philanthropist who donated millions to charity every year, not the pillar of the community who graced magazine covers and gave inspiring speeches about the American dream. He saw a man who had built his fortune on the backs of people like Thomas Chen, who had measured success in profit margins rather than human lives, who had spent 25 years telling himself that wealth absolved him of responsibility for the collateral damage of his ambition. Marcus Wellington, master of the universe, had been judged by a 25-year-old waitress who worked 3 jobs to survive and found himself utterly, irredeemably lacking. The revelation that Emily Chen was standing before him, serving him coffee in a run-down diner while working multiple jobs just to stay afloat, shattered something fundamental inside Marcus. He had spent the last 25 years building an empire, accumulating wealth and power beyond most people's wildest dreams, while Thomas Chen's daughter struggled to make ends meet. The injustice of it was so profound, so morally bankrupt, that he felt physically ill. Marcus had always told himself that business was business, that the free market rewarded hard work and punished laziness, that people's circumstances were largely the result of their own choices. But looking at Emily, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes and the worn fabric of her uniform, he couldn't escape the truth that her circumstances were largely the result of his choices. His decision to cut safety costs had killed her father, and his company's minimal settlement had clearly been inadequate to provide for a widow and young child. "Emily," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't," she said firmly. "Don't you dare try to justify it or explain it away. I know what happened to my father. I know about the safety violations, the rushed timeline, the corners that were cut to save money. My mother spent years fighting your lawyers, trying to get enough money to keep us from losing our house. Do you know what it's like to watch your mother work herself to death, trying to make up for the income that disappeared when her husband died saving other people's lives?" Marcus felt tears burning behind his eyes, but he didn't have the right to cry. Not here, not in front of her. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words feeling pathetically inadequate. "Are you?" Emily's voice was steady now, controlled in a way that reminded him painfully of her father. Thomas had always been calm under pressure, had always spoken thoughtfully even when delivering unwelcome news. "Are you really sorry, or are you just sorry that you got caught? Sorry that you had to look me in the eye and remember what your greed cost my family?" The question cut him to the bone, because he couldn't answer it honestly. Was he sorry about Thomas's death, or was he sorry about being confronted with the consequences of his actions? Had he ever truly mourned the man who died, or had he simply mourned the inconvenience and legal complications that followed? "I don't know," he admitted, the honesty surprising them both. "I don't know if I'm capable of being sorry in the way you deserve. I've spent so many years telling myself that it was just an accident, that these things happen, that I did everything I reasonably could. But sitting here looking at you, I realize that I never asked myself what reasonably meant. I never asked myself what I owed to the people who built my success." Emily studied his face for a long moment, searching for something he wasn't sure he possessed. "My father talked about you sometimes," she said finally. "Before he died, when he was getting frustrated with the job. He said you were a smart man, but that you saw people as numbers on a spreadsheet instead of human beings with families who depended on them coming home safe every day." The accuracy of the assessment was devastating. Marcus had indeed seen his employees as numbers, as resources to be optimized and costs to be minimized. He had never walked through his job sites thinking about the wives who kissed their husbands goodbye each morning, the children who waited for their fathers to come home, the dreams and aspirations and fears of the people who made his wealth possible. "He was right," Marcus said quietly. "I did see people as numbers. I still do, most of the time. But you're not a number, Emily. You're a person who deserves so much better than what my negligence gave you." "We all deserve better," she replied. My father deserved to see me graduate from college, to walk me down the aisle someday, to meet his grandchildren. My mother deserved to have her husband beside her when she was dying of cancer 10 years ago. And I deserved to grow up with a father who could have taught me how to be strong without having to be strong all the time. Each word was a blow, a precise incision that laid bare the true cost of Marcus's pursuit of profit. He had robbed Emily of her father, her mother of her husband, and countless others of the man Thomas Chen could have become in the years that followed. The ripple effects of that March morning 25 years ago had spread far beyond the construction site, shaping lives and destroying possibilities in ways Marcus had never bothered to consider. "What can I do?" he asked, the question coming from some deep well of desperation he hadn't known he possessed. "How can I make this right?" Emily's laugh was bitter. "You can't bring my father back. You can't give me back the childhood I lost when my mother had to work 3 jobs just like I do now. You can't undo 25 years of struggling and scraping and wondering what my life would have been like if my father had lived." "But there has to be something," Marcus pressed. "Some way to help. Some way to honor his memory." "You want to honor my father's memory?" Emily's eyes flashed with sudden fire. "Then stop doing to other families what you did to mine. Stop treating your workers like disposable assets. Stop cutting corners that put people's lives at risk. Stop building your fortune on other people's blood." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, but he forced himself to absorb them, to sit with the pain and guilt they brought. This was what justice felt like, he realized. Not the sanitized version, dispensed by courts and lawyers, but the raw human truth delivered by someone who had lived with the consequences of his choices every day for 25 years. But even as he accepted her condemnation, Marcus found himself studying Emily more closely, seeing in her not just the victim of his past mistakes, but a woman of extraordinary strength and character. Despite everything that had been taken from her, despite the grinding poverty and endless work, she carried herself with dignity. She spoke with her father's thoughtfulness and honesty, even when that honesty was painful to deliver. She had every right to be bitter and broken, yet she had chosen to remain kind to customers who probably never saw her as more than part of the furniture. "Tell me about him," Marcus said suddenly. "Tell me about your father. Not the accident, not the work stuff. Tell me who he was." Emily looked surprised by the request, but after a moment her expression softened. "He was the kind of man who stopped to help strangers change flat tires, even when he was already running late. He taught me to ride a bike by running alongside me for 3 hours straight until I got it right, and he never once complained about his aching back. He read to me every night, even when he was exhausted from work, and he always did different voices for all the characters." As she spoke, Marcus could see Thomas Chen more clearly than he ever had when the man was alive. Not just the foreman who worried about safety protocols, but a father who sacrificed for his daughter, a husband who loved his wife, a man who found joy in small moments despite the hardships of his work. "He sounds like he was a good man," Marcus said. "He was the best man I ever knew," Emily replied. "And that's what makes this so hard. He believed that people were fundamentally decent, that if you treated others with respect and kindness, they would do the same for you. He trusted you, Mr. Wellington. He believed that you would listen when he warned you about safety problems, because he thought you cared about your workers the way he did. The trust Thomas had placed in him, the faith that had been betrayed so completely, felt like the heaviest burden of all. Marcus had not just taken a man's life through his negligence. He had violated the fundamental human contract that said we look out for each other, that we protect those who depend on us. "I failed him," Marcus said simply. "I failed all of them." "Yes," Emily agreed without hesitation. "You did." The simple acknowledgement was somehow more devastating than any angry accusation could have been. It was the truth, delivered without malice or dramatic flourish, and it settled into Marcus's bones like a permanent weight. They sat in silence for several minutes, the diner around them continuing its late-night rhythm of quiet conversations and clinking dishes. Marcus found himself really seeing the place for the first time, noticing the other customers, an elderly man in a security guard uniform grabbing a quick meal between shifts, a young mother feeding French fries to a toddler while studying textbooks, a construction worker whose hands bore the same calluses and scars that Thomas Chen's had carried. These were the people his empire was built on, Marcus realized. The security guards who protected his buildings, the students working their way through college at minimum wage jobs, the construction workers who turned his architectural dreams into reality. He had spent his entire career moving through the world without really seeing them, treating them as interchangeable parts in the great machine of his success. The other workers, he said suddenly, the ones who were injured in the accident. What happened to them? Emily's expression hardened again. David Martinez lost his left leg below the knee. He was out of work for 2 years, lost his house, his marriage fell apart from the stress. He's a security guard now at one of your shopping centers, actually. Probably doesn't make in a year what you spend on wine. The irony was brutal. Marcus employed the man whose life he had helped destroy, probably passed him in the lobby dozens of times, without recognition or acknowledgement. And the other one, Jim Bradley. He was lucky, if you can call it that. Just a broken back, some internal injuries. He's on permanent disability now, can't work construction anymore. Lives in a studio apartment and gets by on social security checks that don't cover his medications. 3 lives destroyed, 3 families forever changed. And Marcus had moved on without a backward glance. The settlements had been handled by his lawyers, the safety improvements implemented by his insurance company, the whole messy business swept away so he could focus on the next project, the next opportunity to grow his wealth. I need their addresses, Marcus said suddenly. Emily looked at him suspiciously. Why? Because I need to face them. I need to look them in the eye and acknowledge what I did to their lives, and then I need to figure out how to make it right. You can't make it right, Emily said firmly. You can't undo 25 years of consequences. You can't give David his leg back or fix Jim's spine or bring my father back to life. But I can try to repair some of the damage, Marcus insisted. I can make sure they have proper medical care, adequate housing, some security for their remaining years. It won't fix the past, but it might make their futures a little less difficult. Emily studied him carefully, searching his face for signs of sincerity. This isn't about assuaging your guilt, is it? This isn't some grand gesture to make yourself feel better about what you've done. The question forced Marcus to examine his own motives, to dig beneath the surface of his sudden urge to help. Was this about redemption, about earning forgiveness, about transforming himself from villain to hero in some cosmic narrative? Or was it something simpler and more honest? The recognition that he had a responsibility to the people his actions had harmed, regardless of whether that responsibility was legally enforceable or socially expected. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe it started that way, but sitting here, listening to you talk about your father, seeing what my choices did to your life and the lives of David and Jim, I realize that this isn't about me at all. It's about acknowledging that their suffering matters, that their lives have value, that the cost of my success was too high. Emily was quiet for a long moment, refilling his coffee cup automatically as she processed his words. You know what the hardest part has been? She said finally. It wasn't the poverty or the long hours, or even watching my mother work herself to death. It was the invisibility. It was knowing that the man responsible for my father's death went on to become even more successful, more celebrated, more wealthy, while we just disappeared from his world completely. The observation cut deep because it was absolutely true. Marcus had never followed up on the families affected by the accident, had never wondered how they were coping or whether they needed additional support. They had simply vanished from his reality, their suffering rendered invisible by his willful ignorance. "I see you now," he said quietly. "I see all of you, and I can't unsee it." Emily nodded slowly. "That's a start, I suppose, but seeing isn't enough, Mr. Wellington. My father used to say that knowing the right thing to do is easy. The hard part is actually doing it, especially when it costs you something." Marcus felt the weight of her challenge settling over him like a mantle. What was he willing to sacrifice to make amends for his past? How much of his comfort, his wealth, his carefully constructed life was he prepared to give up to honor the memory of Thomas Chen and support the people his negligence had harmed? The answer, he realized with growing clarity, was as much as it took. But even as he made this resolution, Marcus understood that Emily was right about one thing. This wasn't really about him. It wasn't about his redemption or his journey toward becoming a better person. It was about acknowledging that Thomas Chen's life had mattered, that his death had created ripples of pain and loss that deserved recognition and response. "I want to create a foundation," Marcus said suddenly, the idea crystallizing as he spoke. A workplace safety foundation focused on preventing accidents and supporting the families of workers who are injured or killed on the job. "I want to name it after your father." Emily's eyes widened. "You want to name a foundation after my father?" "The Thomas Chen Foundation for Worker Safety and Family Support," Marcus said, the name feeling right as soon as it left his lips. "It would provide grants for safety equipment and training, lobby for stronger workplace protection laws, and offer financial support and counseling services for families affected by workplace accidents." For the first time since she'd recognized him, Emily's expression softened. "He would like that," she said quietly. "He always said that the worst part of seeing safety violations wasn't the risk to himself, but the thought of other families going through what he knew his would face if something happened to him." Marcus pulled out his phone, his hands still trembling slightly as he began making notes. "I want you to help design it," he said. "You and the other families affected by the accident. You understand what kind of support would actually make a difference, what services are needed, how to reach people who might be too proud or too scared to ask for help." "You're serious about this," Emily said, studying his face intently. "Dead serious," Marcus replied. "And I want to fund it properly, not just throw some pocket change at it and call it charity. I'm talking about $100 million to start, with provisions for ongoing funding from my company's profits." The number was significant enough to make Emily blink. $100 million would fund a substantial organization, one that could actually make a meaningful difference in workplace safety and family support. It was also a sum that would require Marcus to restructure his personal finances, to shift money from his investment portfolio and real estate holdings into something that would benefit others rather than himself. "My father always said that the measure of a man wasn't how much money he made, but how he used whatever power he had to protect people who couldn't protect themselves," Emily said slowly. "Then let me try to measure up to his standard," Marcus replied. "Let me try to be the kind of man he was, even if it's 25 years too late." They talked for another hour, sketching out ideas for the foundation, discussing the specific needs of workplace accident victims and their families. Marcus found himself taking notes on napkins, capturing Emily's insights about everything from the psychological support needed by surviving spouses to the practical challenges of navigating disability benefits and workers' compensation systems. As they talked, other customers came and went, but Marcus barely noticed them. He was completely focused on Emily, on her perspective and experience, on the wisdom she had gained through hardship that he had never acquired through success. She spoke about the isolation that follows tragedy, the way people disappear from your life when you're no longer fun to be around, the exhaustion that comes from having to be strong every single day without relief. "You know what would have meant the most to me when I was growing up," Emily said at one point. "If someone had just acknowledged that my father was a hero, not in some grand, public way, but just recognized that he died trying to save other people, that his life meant something more than just a line item in an insurance claim." Marcus felt something break open inside his chest. In all the legal proceedings and settlements that had followed Thomas's death, no one had ever called him a hero. The focus had been on liability and compensation, on minimizing financial exposure and moving past the unfortunate incident as quickly as possible. Thomas Chen had been reduced to a workplace fatality statistic, his courage and sacrifice forgotten in the rush to resolve the legal complexities of his death. "He was a hero," Marcus said firmly. "Your father died trying to save his co-workers, and that makes him a hero in the truest sense of the word. The foundation won't just be named after him. It will tell his story. Every family we help will know about Thomas Chen's courage and sacrifice." Tears appeared in Emily's eyes for the first time that evening, and Marcus realized that this simple acknowledgement meant more to her than any amount of money ever could. She had spent 25 years carrying her father's memory alone, protecting his legacy through her own quiet strength and dignity. To have that legacy recognized and honored publicly was a gift she had never dared to hope for. "There's something else," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "I want you to run it. The foundation, I mean. You understand what families need in ways that I never could. You've lived this experience, and you have the insight and compassion to make sure the foundation actually helps people instead of just making donors feel good about themselves." Emily stared at him in shock. "You want me to run a $100 million foundation? You're working 3 jobs to support yourself, which tells me you understand the value of hard work and money. You've maintained your integrity and kindness despite everything you've been through, which tells me you have the character to handle responsibility. And you've just spent the last hour giving me more practical insight about workplace safety and victim support than I've heard from all my corporate consultants combined. But I don't have experience with that kind of organization, that kind of responsibility. Neither did I when I started my first construction company," Marcus interrupted. "But I had the motivation to learn and the determination to succeed. You have those qualities, plus something I never had, a genuine understanding of the people you'd be trying to help." Emily was quiet for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what he was offering. Running a major foundation would mean leaving her 3 jobs, leaving the constant struggle to make ends meet, leaving the life of quiet desperation that had defined her existence since her father's death. "I'd want David and Jim involved too," she said finally, "not just as consultants but as board members. They've earned the right to have a voice in how we help other families." "Absolutely," Marcus agreed. "This foundation should be guided by the people who understand its mission most personally." They spent another 30 minutes working out basic details. Emily would start immediately as executive director, with a salary that would finally allow her to focus on meaningful work instead of survival. David Martinez and Jim Bradley would serve on the board of directors, providing oversight and guidance based on their own experiences. Marcus would provide not just funding, but also access to his business networks, his legal and accounting resources, his connections with government officials and other philanthropists who might support the cause. As they talked, Marcus found himself seeing Emily not as the daughter of a man he had wronged, but as a remarkable woman in her own right. Her insights were sharp, her questions thoughtful, her instincts about helping people both practical and compassionate. She had taken the worst experience of her life and transformed it into wisdom that could benefit others facing similar tragedies. "There's one more thing," Marcus said, as Emily prepared to end her shift. "I want to publicly acknowledge what happened to your father. Not just in foundation materials, but in a speech to my company's shareholders, in interviews with business publications, in any forum where I can reach other executives who might be making the same mistakes I made." Emily looked surprised. "You want to publicly admit to causing my father's death?" "I want to publicly admit to valuing profits over people's lives," Marcus corrected. "I want other business leaders to understand the true cost of cutting corners on safety, and I want the world to know that Thomas Chen was a better man than I was, that his death was a tragedy that could and should have been prevented." The admission would be professionally damaging, Marcus knew. It would invite lawsuits, regulatory scrutiny, and public criticism. His shareholders would be furious. His business associates would question his judgment, and his carefully cultivated reputation as a successful entrepreneur would be forever tarnished by the association with workplace fatalities and safety violations. But sitting in Murphy's diner at 2 in the morning, looking at the daughter of the man whose death he had caused, Marcus realized that protecting his reputation was less important than protecting future families from experiencing the same loss that Emily had endured. "My father would be proud," Emily said softly. "Not of the foundation or the money, though those things matter. He'd be proud that you finally decided to put people before profits." Marcus nodded, feeling something shift inside him that he couldn't quite name. For the first time in 25 years, he felt like he was moving in the right direction, like he was finally becoming the kind of man who deserved the success he had achieved. As Emily gathered her things and prepared to clock out, Marcus stood and extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, "for your honesty, for your insight, for giving me a chance to do better." Emily shook his hand, her grip firm and steady. "Don't thank me yet, Mr. Wellington. Thank me in 5 years when the foundation has prevented some other little girl from losing her father to preventable negligence." Marcus nodded, understanding that her trust would have to be earned through actions rather than promises. But for the first time since Thomas Chen's death, he felt like he had a clear path forward, a way to transform his guilt and regret into something that could make a real difference in the world. The establishment of the Thomas Chen Foundation marked the beginning of Marcus Wellington's transformation from a man who saw workers as numbers to one who understood their humanity. But it was far from the end of his journey toward redemption. Over the following months, Marcus threw himself into the Foundation's work with the same intensity he had once reserved for building his business empire. He spent hours interviewing families affected by workplace accidents, learning about the specific challenges they faced and the gaps in existing support systems. He toured construction sites with safety experts, seeing for the first time the daily risks that workers like Thomas Chen faced to build his projects. Emily proved to be an exceptional foundation director, combining her personal understanding of victim families with a natural talent for organization and leadership. She recruited David Martinez and Jim Bradley to the board, along with safety experts, victim advocates, and family counselors who could provide comprehensive support services. David Martinez, the former construction worker who had lost his leg in the same accident that killed Thomas, initially approached the foundation with deep suspicion. When Marcus met with him personally to discuss his role on the board, David's first words were blunt. "You think throwing money at this makes up for what you did to us?" "No," Marcus replied honestly. "I think this is what I should have been doing all along, regardless of what happened 25 years ago." You and Thomas and Jim deserve to work in a safe environment, and families like yours deserve support when the worst happens. The fact that I'm only realizing this now doesn't make it less true." David studied Marcus carefully, looking for signs of insincerity or self-serving motivation. "Emily says you're willing to admit publicly that you caused the accident. I'm willing to admit that my cost-cutting decisions created unsafe working conditions that led to your injuries and Thomas's death," Marcus corrected. "That's not the same as causing the accident, but it's close enough that the distinction doesn't matter to the people who were hurt." Over several meetings, David gradually warmed to the Foundation's mission, though he never let Marcus forget the personal cost of his negligence. "You want to know what it was like?" David said during one board meeting. "Try putting on your pants with one leg while your wife pretends she's not crying in the bathroom because the disability checks don't cover the mortgage." Jim Bradley, the third victim of the accident, proved to be equally direct in his assessment of Marcus's motives and methods. During their first meeting, Jim asked pointedly, "How do I know this isn't just some tax write-off scheme that makes you look good while helping nobody?" Marcus had been prepared for the question. "Because I'm putting Emily in charge, not some corporate executive who's never been affected by workplace accidents. Because David and you have veto power over any major decisions. And because I'm committing not just to funding, but to using my business connections to push for stronger safety regulations across the industry." The promise to advocate for stronger regulations was one that Marcus took seriously, despite the potential cost to his own business interests. He began lobbying for stricter safety requirements, better inspector training, and harsher penalties for companies that violated workplace safety laws. His advocacy put him at odds with many of his business associates, who saw his position as unnecessarily costly and potentially damaging to the construction industry's competitiveness. "You're committing commercial suicide," his longtime business partner warned during a heated board meeting. "These safety requirements you're pushing will add millions to our project costs." "Good," Marcus replied firmly. "If we can't build safely, we shouldn't be building at all. And if we can't absorb the cost of protecting our workers, we don't deserve to be in business." The conflict with his business partners came to a head 6 months after the Foundation's launch, when Marcus announced his intention to implement the most stringent safety standards in the industry across all Wellington construction projects. The new standards would require additional safety equipment, longer training periods, and more frequent inspections, potentially adding 15% to project costs. "The shareholders will never approve this," his chief financial officer warned. "You're essentially volunteering to become uncompetitive in the bidding process. Then we'll find clients who value worker safety over rock-bottom prices," Marcus replied. "And if we can't, we'll downsize until we can operate profitably under proper safety standards." The showdown with his shareholders was as brutal as Marcus had expected. In the tense board meeting, he faced accusations of reckless sentimentality, poor business judgment, and betrayal of his fiduciary responsibilities to maximize profits. "This is exactly the kind of bleeding heart nonsense that destroys successful companies," declared Richard Hartwell, the largest minority shareholder. "You're letting guilt over one unfortunate accident cloud your business judgment." Marcus stood at the head of the conference table, looking out at faces that had once regarded him with respect and admiration, but now showed varying degrees of anger, disappointment, and concern. These were people who had invested in Wellington construction based on his track record of profitable growth, not his commitment to social responsibility. "One unfortunate accident," Marcus repeated slowly. "That one unfortunate accident killed a good man and destroyed 3 families. And it happened because we prioritized profit margins over human lives. I won't make that mistake again." "Then you'll make it as the former CEO of a bankrupt construction company," Hartwell shot back. Because that's where this path leads. Our competitors will underbid us on every major project and will be out of business within 2 years. The threat was real, Marcus knew. The construction industry operated on razor-thin margins, and companies that couldn't compete on price often didn't survive. But as he looked around the table at these wealthy, successful people who had never swung a hammer or climbed scaffolding 40 feet above concrete, he realized that their definition of success had become meaningless to him. If we can't run this company safely and profitably, then maybe we don't deserve to run it at all, Marcus said quietly. And if that makes me a bad CEO in your eyes, then so be it. The vote of no confidence was closer than Marcus had expected, but it ultimately failed. Enough shareholders were willing to give him 1 year to prove that his new safety standards wouldn't destroy the company's competitiveness. It was a narrow victory, but it gave him the breathing room he needed to implement his reforms. The real test came 3 months later when Wellington Construction submitted bids for the new Metropolitan Hospital expansion project. Their bid was 18% higher than the lowest competitor, a difference that Marcus's old self would have found unacceptable. But the higher bid reflected the true cost of building safely, of providing proper equipment and training, of allowing adequate time for safety inspections and protocols. Marcus was prepared to lose the contract, but something unexpected happened. The hospital's board, influenced partly by the publicity surrounding the Thomas Chen Foundation and Marcus's public admissions about past safety failures, chose Wellington Construction despite the higher bid. They cited the company's new commitment to worker safety and their confidence that the project would be completed without the accidents and delays that often plagued construction sites. The Metropolitan Hospital project became a showcase for Wellington Construction's new approach to safety and worker welfare. Marcus visited the site daily, not to micromanage, but to reinforce the importance of safety protocols and to ensure that workers felt comfortable reporting potential hazards without fear of retaliation. The project was completed on time and under budget despite the additional safety measures, proving that protecting workers and maintaining profitability weren't mutually exclusive goals. Word of Wellington Construction's safety record began to spread throughout the industry. Other companies, facing increasing pressure from regulators and labor unions, began adopting similar measures. The Thomas Chen Foundation expanded its mission to include training programs for safety supervisors and lobbying efforts for industry-wide reforms. Emily's leadership of the foundation exceeded even Marcus's optimistic expectations. She had a natural talent for connecting with families in crisis, for understanding their needs and translating those needs into effective programs and services. Under her direction, the foundation provided everything from emergency financial assistance to job retraining programs for injured workers who could no longer perform their original duties. "She's remarkable," Marcus told David Martinez during a foundation board meeting. "She's turned her tragedy into a source of strength for other people facing similar losses." David nodded, though his expression remained somewhat guarded. Despite working closely with Marcus for almost a year, he still harbored deep reservations about the man whose negligence had cost him his leg and his livelihood. "Emily's forgiven you," David said carefully. "But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. I still wake up every morning missing my leg. Jim still can't lift his grandson without his back seizing up, and Thomas is still dead." The blunt assessment hit Marcus like a physical blow, but he forced himself to absorb it without defensiveness. David was right, of course. All the foundations and safety reforms in the world couldn't undo the damage that had been done 25 years ago. "I know," Marcus replied quietly, "and I know that nothing I do now can truly make up for what I did then, but I have to try, not because I expect forgiveness or redemption, but because it's the right thing to do." David studied Marcus's face for several moments, searching for signs of self-serving motivation or hollow platitudes. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "That's the first honest thing you've said since this whole thing started. You can't make up for the past, but you can maybe prevent other families from going through what we went through." The conversation marked a turning point in David's relationship with Marcus. While they would never be friends in any traditional sense, David began to see Marcus not as the villain of his personal story, but as a flawed human being who was genuinely trying to do better. It was a grudging respect built on actions rather than words, on consistent behavior rather than grand gestures. Jim Bradley's journey toward acceptance took longer and followed a different path. Unlike David, who had maintained his anger as a form of protection, Jim had retreated into a shell of resigned bitterness. The chronic pain from his injuries had worn away at his spirit over the years, leaving him exhausted and isolated. Marcus's first attempts to connect with Jim were met with polite but distant responses. Jim attended board meetings and provided input when asked, but he kept himself emotionally removed from the foundation's work. It was Emily who finally broke through Jim's defensive barriers. "He's not the same man who made those decisions 25 years ago," Emily told Jim during a private conversation. "I'm not saying he's become a saint or that we should forget what he did to our families, but he's genuinely changed. And that change is helping other people." "How can you be sure he's really changed?" Jim asked. "How do you know this isn't just an elaborate public relations campaign to rehabilitate his reputation?" Emily considered the question carefully before answering. "Because he's costing himself money and influence to do the right thing. Because he's facing criticism from his business associates and shareholders for putting worker safety ahead of profits. And because he listens when we tell him he's wrong about something, even when it's uncomfortable for him to hear." The proof of Emily's assessment came during a heated foundation board meeting about expanding their services to include mental health support for accident victims' families. Marcus had initially been skeptical about the cost and complexity of providing psychological counseling, arguing that their resources should focus on immediate practical needs like medical bills and income replacement. Jim, speaking more passionately than anyone had heard him speak before, challenged Marcus's position. "You think losing my ability to work was the worst part of that accident? You think David's biggest problem is walking on a prosthetic leg? The worst part was watching our families fall apart because we couldn't cope with what happened to us. My wife left me because I turned into someone she didn't recognize, someone bitter and angry and impossible to live with." The raw pain in Jim's voice silenced the room. Marcus, visibly shaken by the revelation, immediately withdrew his objections to the mental health program. More than that, he personally funded an expansion of the program to include family counseling and support groups for spouses and children affected by workplace accidents. "I'm sorry, Jim," Marcus said after the meeting. "I should have understood that the emotional damage was just as real as the physical injuries." Jim nodded, accepting the apology without enthusiasm. But over the following months, as the Foundation's mental health services began helping other families cope with trauma and loss, Jim gradually became more engaged with the organization's mission. He began speaking at safety conferences, sharing his story with construction workers and supervisors who might otherwise dismiss safety protocols as bureaucratic inconvenience. The Foundation's influence continued to grow throughout its second year of operation. Emily had built partnerships with labor unions, regulatory agencies, and other safety organizations, creating a network of advocates who could push for reforms at every level of the construction industry. The Foundation's research department, staffed by safety engineers and public health experts, began publishing studies that documented the true cost of workplace accidents and the economic benefits of comprehensive safety programs. Marcus found himself becoming a reluctant public figure in the workplace safety movement. His speeches at industry conferences, where he candidly discussed his past failures and the human cost of cutting corners, drew large audiences and significant media attention. Business publications began writing about his transformation from profit-focused executive to safety advocate, though the coverage wasn't always favorable. Wellington's conversion to the Church of Worker Safety is admirable, wrote one prominent business columnist, but his willingness to publicly flagellate himself for past mistakes raises questions about his judgment and emotional stability. Shareholders in companies led by born-again safety zealots should be prepared for reduced returns and increased regulatory scrutiny. The criticism stung, but it also validated Marcus's commitment to his new priorities. If his advocacy for worker safety was making his business associates uncomfortable, if his admissions of past negligence were damaging his reputation in corporate circles, then he was probably on the right track. The real test of Marcus's transformation came during the Foundation's second anniversary celebration, held at the same hotel where Thomas Chen's funeral reception had taken place 27 years earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of the attendees, particularly Thomas's widow, Margaret Chen, who had flown in from California for the event. Margaret had remarried 15 years after Thomas's death, eventually finding happiness with a kind man who had helped her heal from the trauma of losing her first husband. But seeing Marcus again, even in the context of honoring her late husband's memory, was emotionally difficult. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Margaret told Marcus during a quiet moment at the reception. "I know that Emily has, and I know that the Foundation is doing good work, but I still see the man who took my husband away from me." Marcus nodded, accepting her judgment without argument. "I don't expect your forgiveness, Mrs. Chen. I don't deserve it, but I hope you can see that your husband's memory is helping protect other families from going through what you went through." Margaret studied his face, looking for the arrogant executive she remembered from the lawsuit proceedings decades earlier. Instead, she saw a man aged by guilt and responsibility, someone who carried the weight of his mistakes in the lines around his eyes and the careful way he chose his words. "Thomas would have liked what you've become," she said finally. "He always believed that people could change if they really wanted to. He would have been proud of Emily for turning her pain into something that helps others." The conversation with Margaret Chen provided Marcus with a form of closure he hadn't realized he needed. Her acknowledgement that Thomas would have approved of his transformation, even if she couldn't fully forgive him personally, felt like a benediction from beyond the grave. As the Foundation entered its third year, Marcus began to consider his own mortality and legacy in ways he never had before. At 65, he was still healthy and energetic, but he was no longer young. The question of what would happen to his wealth and his companies after his death took on new urgency, particularly as it related to the Foundation's long-term sustainability. Marcus's decision to restructure his will and establish a permanent endowment for the Thomas Chen Foundation surprised no one who had watched his transformation over the past 3 years. What did surprise his family and business associates was the magnitude of his commitment. Upon his death, 80% of his estate would go to the Foundation, ensuring its operations in perpetuity. His adult children, who had been largely absent from his life during his single-minded pursuit of wealth, reacted to the news with a mixture of disappointment and grudging respect. His daughter Sarah, a successful attorney in her own right, challenged him during a tense family dinner. "Dad, I understand wanting to do good with your money, but 80%. What about your grandchildren's college funds? What about maintaining the family legacy?" Marcus looked around the table at his children and their spouses. all of whom had benefited significantly from his wealth over the years. They were good people, but they had never known struggle or want, had never been forced to work 3 jobs just to pay rent or choose between medicine and groceries. "The family legacy I want to leave isn't about money," Marcus said quietly. "It's about taking responsibility for our actions and using whatever power we have to protect people who can't protect themselves." That's the lesson I learned from Thomas Chen, and it's the lesson I want my grandchildren to learn. His son Michael, who worked in the family business, raised practical concerns about the foundation's management and oversight. "How do we know the foundation will continue to operate according to your wishes after you're gone? How do we prevent it from becoming just another bureaucratic charity that spends more on administration than on helping people?" The question had kept Marcus awake many nights, leading him to develop a complex governance structure that would protect the Foundation's mission while ensuring its effectiveness. Emily would serve as executive director for life, with David Martinez and Jim Bradley holding permanent seats on the board of directors. A diverse group of safety experts, victim advocates and family representatives would provide ongoing oversight and direction. "The foundation belongs to the families it serves," Marcus explained. "My money funds it, but they control it. That's the only way to ensure it stays true to Thomas's memory and continues to make a real difference in people's lives." The governance structure Marcus created became a model for other philanthropic organizations, particularly those focused on worker safety and victim advocacy. By placing control in the hands of the people most directly affected by workplace accidents, the foundation avoided many of the pitfalls that plagued traditional charities: bureaucratic bloat, mission drift, and disconnection from the communities they claimed to serve. As Marcus approached his 70th birthday, the foundation had grown into one of the most influential workplace safety organizations in the country. Its research had led to new federal regulations, its training programs had been adopted by construction companies nationwide, and its family support services had helped thousands of people cope with the aftermath of workplace accidents. Emily, now in her mid-30s, had evolved into one of the most respected voices in the occupational safety movement. She spoke regularly at congressional hearings, consulted with international safety organizations, and had authored 2 books about workplace safety and family resilience. Her journey from struggling waitress to foundation executive had inspired countless others to transform their personal tragedies into forces for positive change. David Martinez had also found new purpose through his work with the foundation. Despite his permanent disability, he had become a powerful advocate for injured workers, helping them navigate the complex systems of workers' compensation and disability benefits. His blunt, no-nonsense approach to dealing with bureaucracy and corporate resistance had earned him the nickname the Bulldog among the families he served. Jim Bradley's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of all. The bitter, isolated man who had attended the foundation's first board meeting had gradually emerged from his shell of pain and resentment to become a compassionate counselor and mentor. His support groups for men dealing with workplace injuries and chronic pain had helped hundreds of people find ways to rebuild their lives and relationships. The 3 men whose lives had been forever changed by that March morning 27 years earlier had formed an unlikely partnership built on shared tragedy and mutual respect. They disagreed frequently about tactics and priorities, but they never lost sight of their common mission: preventing other families from experiencing the loss and trauma they had endured. Marcus's role in the foundation had evolved over the years from primary funder to elder advisor. He continued to provide financial support and business expertise, but he was careful not to override the judgment of Emily and the board members who had more direct experience with the foundation's mission. His presence at foundation events was always welcomed, but he no longer needed to be the center of attention or the primary spokesperson for the organization. The transformation was complete when Marcus realized that he derived more satisfaction from the foundation's quarterly reports than from his company's profit statements. The number of families helped, the safety improvements implemented at job sites, the lives saved through better training and equipment, these had become his true measures of success. On a quiet evening in late autumn, Marcus found himself back at Murphy's Diner, sitting in the same booth where his journey toward redemption had begun. The diner looked much the same as it had 5 years earlier, though Emily no longer worked there. She had purchased the building through the foundation and converted it into a community resource center, offering job training and support services for low-income families. As Marcus sipped his coffee and watched the rain streak down the windows, he reflected on the path that had led him from that moment of recognition to his current state of hard-won peace. Thomas Chen's death had been a tragedy that couldn't be undone, but its aftermath had become a source of healing and hope for countless others facing similar losses. The waitress who served him that evening was a young woman named Isabella, a single mother working her way through nursing school with the help of a foundation scholarship. She didn't know who Marcus was. The foundation kept his identity private in its scholarship programs, but she treated him with the same professional courtesy that Emily had shown years earlier. "Anything else I can get for you?" Isabella asked as she refilled his coffee cup. "No, thank you," Marcus replied, genuinely grateful for her service. "You're doing a great job." Isabella smiled, pleased by the simple acknowledgement. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." Took her some. As she walked away to serve other customers, Marcus thought about the countless workers who had built his fortune over the decades, the people whose names he had never learned and whose contributions he had never properly acknowledged. He couldn't go back and thank them all, couldn't undo years of treating people as mere components in his business operations, but he could ensure that the workers building his projects today were treated with dignity and respect, that their safety was prioritized above profit margins, that their families were protected if the worst happened. The rain continued to fall as Marcus finished his coffee and prepared to leave. Tomorrow there would be another foundation board meeting, another opportunity to advocate for stronger safety regulations, another chance to honor Thomas Chen's memory by protecting the lives and livelihoods of working people. As he stepped out into the night, Marcus realized that he had finally become the kind of man Thomas Chen had always been, someone who put people before profits, who measured success by the positive impact he had on others' lives, who understood that true wealth came from the connections we forge and the good we do rather than the money we accumulate. The transformation had taken 5 years and cost him millions of dollars, but Marcus Wellington had finally learned the most important lesson of his life, that every person matters, that every life has value, and that those who have power and privilege have an obligation to use them in service of others. Thomas Chen would have been proud.